The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and something else I couldn't quite name, something sharp and metallic that felt too close to fear. I was lying there under thin white sheets, an IV in my arm, listening to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor beside me. 48 hours. That's what the surgeon had said. The tumor was aggressive, but operable if we moved fast, if we paid the deposit, if everything went exactly right. I had done everything right. For 15 years, I built a medical fund, brick by brick. I skipped vacations. I packed lunches. I worked overtime when my body begged me to rest. I told myself that being careful, being responsible, being the strong one would one day save me. And now that day had come. All I had to do was transfer the money. So when the hospital administrator handed me the forms and I reached for my phone, I felt something close to relief. My hands were trembling, but that was from the medication, or so I thought. I opened my banking app, and the numbers staring back at me didn't make sense. I blinked, refreshed, logged out, logged back in. 1274 yuan. My medical fund over $50,000 was gone. Not frozen, not pending, gone. The room felt like it tilted. My fingers went cold. I called the bank, my voice barely steady enough to form the words. The representative spoke carefully, like someone handling glass. 4 maximum ATM withdrawals, 2 days in a row, and then an in-person withdrawal, $8,000 signed at the counter by a woman crying about her dying sister. She signed my name. There was only one person who knew about my backup card. Only one person who knew my PIN. Only one person who knew exactly how much money I had saved and exactly what it meant. My sister. When I called her, she didn't deny it. She laughed. "You think you're going to live long enough to spend that money," she said. I needed a car. Be realistic. I was lying in a hospital bed, waiting for surgery that might save my life, and my own sister had already decided I was as good as dead. But she made one mistake. She thought I would do what I had always done, stay quiet, absorb the damage, protect the family at my own expense. She was wrong. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just change my life. It forced the truth into a courtroom, shattered a lifetime of silence, and finally revealed what my family had been pretending not to see for 36 years. My name is Michelle Howard. I'm 36 years old. And for the past 12 years, I've worked as a financial analyst at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio. Numbers have always made sense to me. Spreadsheets balance. Accounts reconcile. Risks can be calculated. If you prepare carefully enough, you can protect yourself from most disasters. At least, that's what I used to believe. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of how my sister emptied my medical treatment fund while I was lying in a hospital bed waiting for surgery that might save my life. I'm going to tell you what she said when I confronted her. I'm going to tell you what my parents did, and I'm going to tell you what happened when that laughter echoed all the way into a courtroom. But to understand how it got that far, you need to understand the moment everything broke. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and something heavier underneath it, fear, maybe. The kind that clings to the air even after the floors have been scrubbed and the lights turned low. I was lying beneath thin white sheets, an IV taped to my arm, watching the steady green line on the heart monitor rise and fall as if it belonged to someone braver than me. 48 hours. That was the window the surgeon had given me. The tumor was aggressive but still operable. "We caught it just in time," he had said gently, as if those words were supposed to feel comforting. Surgery needed to happen fast. The prognosis was good if we moved quickly. And if I paid the deposit, I wasn't panicked about the money. I had prepared for this. For 15 years, I built a medical fund piece by piece. I skipped vacations. I drove the same car long after my friends upgraded theirs. I packed lunches when everyone else ordered takeout. I worked overtime shifts, even when I was tired of proving that I could handle more. That fund wasn't just savings. It was proof. Proof that my quiet, disciplined life had value. Proof that I didn't need to rely on anyone. Proof that being the responsible one meant something. So when the hospital administrator stepped into my room the next morning with paperwork and a calm, professional smile, I felt something close to relief. "I'll just transfer the deposit now," I told her. My hands were trembling, but I blamed it on the medication. I picked up my phone and opened my banking app. The number on the screen didn't make sense. I blinked, refreshed, logged out, logged back in. 1,274美元. For a second, my brain refused to process it. My medical fund over $50,000 was gone. Not on hold, not pending, not delayed. Gone. My mouth went dry. I could hear the heart monitor quicken beside me. I refreshed again, as if sheer willpower could reverse reality. Nothing changed. I called the bank with fingers that barely obeyed me. The representative's voice shifted into that careful tone people use when they know something is very wrong. "Yes, Miss Howard," she said slowly. "I'm seeing 4 ATM withdrawals over the past 2 days. Maximum daily limit each time. And there was also an in-person withdrawal of $8,000 at one of our branches." "In person?" I whispered. Yes, the withdrawal was processed by a senior officer. The individual presented identification and signed for the funds. Signed. I was transferred to the officer who handled it, Mrs. Patterson. 30 years in banking, steady, experienced, not easily fooled. "I remember her," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice heavy. She was crying. She said her sister was dying and needed emergency treatment. She was very convincing. She signed right in front of me. My name. The room felt smaller, like the walls were inching closer. There was only one person who knew about my backup card. Only one person who knew the PIN I had written down in a notebook inside my desk drawer. Only one person who knew the exact amount I had saved and exactly what it was for. My sister, Rebecca. 3 days earlier, she had shown up at my apartment with homemade soup and soft eyes. "You shouldn't be alone," she had said. "Let me stay and help." I had been so tired, so scared, so desperate to believe that maybe, finally, she was growing up. That maybe illness would do what nothing else had bring us closer. I had told her about the surgery, about the timeline, about the cost. I had even mentioned the backup ATM card at home, just in case something happened and I couldn't access my account myself. I thought I was sharing information with family. I didn't realize I was handing her the key. When I called Rebecca from that hospital bed, I still clung to a shred of hope that there had been some misunderstanding, some terrible mix-up. She answered on the second ring. "Oh," she said lightly when I asked about the withdrawals. "You found out." There was no panic in her voice, no denial. "Rebecca," I said, my throat tightening. "That money was for my surgery." She laughed. Not nervous laughter, not embarrassed laughter, cold laughter. "You think you're going to live long enough to spend that money?" she said. "Come on, Michelle. I needed a car. Be realistic. Why let good money sit in an account for a dead woman?" The heart monitor began to beep faster. A nurse peeked inside the room, but I waved her away. I couldn't let anyone see what those words had done to me. In that moment, the worst pain wasn't in my body. It was the realization that my sister had already calculated my death into her purchase. And what hurt even more, what cut deeper than the theft itself, was the quiet understanding that she believed she could get away with it, because I had always let her. I had always been the strong one, the forgiving one, the one who absorbed the damage and called it love. My parents used to say I was so independent, as if that were a compliment. Rebecca, meanwhile, was the one who struggled, who needed help, who made mistakes, everyone rushed to fix. I lay there staring at the ceiling, my future suddenly uncertain in more ways than one, and something inside me shifted. For 36 years, I had been my family's safety net. That day, I decided I was done being the thing that catches everyone else when they fall. Because this time, if I stayed silent, I wouldn't just lose money, I might lose my life. And what happened next, what unfolded over the following weeks, would expose more than a stolen bank account. It would expose a decade of lies, a pattern of fraud, and a family dynamic built on my willingness to endure. So, if you've ever been the strong one, the reliable one, the person everyone assumes will figure it out, stay with me. Because this is the story of the day I stopped figuring it out for everyone else and started fighting back. If you had met me a year ago, you would have described my life as stable, predictable, quiet. I worked full-time as a financial analyst at the same hospital where I would later become a patient. I showed up early, left late, and rarely took a sick day. I liked knowing how things added up. I liked control. After my divorce 8 years ago, control was the one thing I clung to. My marriage had ended without fireworks, no screaming matches, no dramatic betrayal, just the slow erosion of two people realizing they wanted different lives. When it was over, I packed my things, signed the papers, and told everyone I was fine. I became very good at being fine. I moved into a small apartment with neutral walls and secondhand furniture that didn't match, but didn't owe anyone anything either. I built routines, coffee at 6:30, work by 8, gym twice a week, grocery list every Sunday. I learned how to live alone without feeling lonely most of the time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steady felt safe. What I didn't talk about much was my family. I don't say that with bitterness, not at first. My parents loved me. I truly believe that. They provided for us, showed up to school events, kept a roof over our heads. But love in our house had a hierarchy I didn't understand until much later. I was the older sister, the responsible one, the calm one, the child who never got in trouble, who did her homework without being asked, who didn't cry unless something was truly unbearable. My parents praised me for being independent. "Michelle doesn't need much," they would say proudly to relatives. "She's so self-sufficient." At the time, I wore that like a badge. What I didn't realize was that being the child who doesn't need much slowly turns you into the child who doesn't get much. Rebecca, my younger sister, was different from the start. Where I was quiet, she was loud. Where I thought things through, she acted first and explained later. She felt everything intensely and made sure everyone else felt it too. If she was happy, the house buzzed. If she was upset, the air shifted. She had a way of commanding attention without even trying. Or maybe she was trying. I don't know anymore. As teenagers, the pattern became clearer. Rebecca would get into arguments at school, quit clubs halfway through the semester, fall out with friends, and then cry about betrayal at the dinner table. My parents would gather around her like paramedics around an accident victim. They would soothe her, defend her, sometimes even call teachers to clarify misunderstandings. Meanwhile, I sat across from them, finishing my homework, telling myself it didn't matter. I didn't need that kind of attention. I told myself that being low maintenance was strength. By the time we were adults, the pattern had hardened into something almost invisible because it felt so normal. Rebecca married young, divorced quickly, married again, divorced again. Each time, it was someone else's fault. He was controlling. He was immature. He didn't understand her dreams. My parents listened, nodded, helped her move out, helped her pay deposits, helped her start over. I was there too, carrying boxes downstairs, assembling furniture, transferring small amounts of money when she said she was short on rent, not because my parents asked me to, because I thought that's what family did. When Rebecca changed jobs every year or two, there was always a story, a toxic boss, a jealous coworker, a company that didn't appreciate her talents. My parents would shake their heads sympathetically and say, "She just hasn't found her place yet." I had found my place. I stayed. I endured. I built stability the way some people build empires. And slowly, without meaning to, I became the fallback plan. 5 years ago, Rebecca called me at midnight, sobbing. She said she had maxed out her credit cards and collectors were threatening to garnish her wages. She said she couldn't tell mom and dad because they'd already done so much. She said she felt ashamed. That word ashamed broke something in me, because I knew that feeling. I knew what it was like to feel like you had failed. So I transferred her $8,000 the next morning. It wasn't money I had lying around casually. It came from my savings, from careful budgeting, from saying no to things I wanted. But I told myself this was temporary. She promised she would pay me back. She promised it was the last time she would let things spiral. She never paid me back. When I gently asked about it months later, she got defensive, said I was making her feel small, said I knew she was trying. I dropped it, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want to be the reason she cried again. That was my role, to smooth, to absorb, to keep peace. Looking back now, I can see how those small decisions trained her to believe there were no consequences. Every time she stumbled, someone caught her. And if my parents couldn't, I would. They never once asked if I needed help. Not because they didn't care, but because I had built an image of myself as someone who didn't. Even when I told them about my diagnosis, I framed it like a presentation. Calm, organized. The surgery is minimally invasive. Insurance covers most of it. I've saved enough to handle the rest. I remember watching relief cross their faces, not because I was going to be okay, but because I wasn't going to become a problem. Rebecca's eyes, though, sharpened when I mentioned the savings, just for a second. Then she smiled and asked practical questions. Which bank? What if I couldn't access it after anesthesia? Did I have a backup plan? At the time, I thought she was worried. I didn't understand that she was calculating. I had spent my entire life being the stable one, the dependable one, the person who never let cracks show. And that stability made me invisible in ways I didn't recognize until I was staring at a hospital ceiling wondering how my account could be almost empty. What hurts most when I think back isn't just the theft. It's the realization that the groundwork for it was laid long before I got sick. It was laid in childhood compliments about independence, in midnight rescue calls, in parents who believed one daughter needed protecting and the other could handle herself. I wasn't the loved daughter. I was the reliable resource. And when you grow up being treated like a resource, you don't notice when someone starts withdrawing from you. Not until you open your bank account and see the balance. And by then, the damage is already done. Rebecca has always known how to enter a room. Some people demand attention by being loud. Rebecca does it by being vulnerable. She walks in with a story already forming in her eyes, a tremor in her voice, a half-finished sentence that makes everyone lean closer. It's not something she practices in front of a mirror. It's instinct, survival, performance blended so seamlessly with truth that even she might not know where one ends and the other begins. If you asked a stranger to describe her, they would probably say she's magnetic, funny, expressive, the kind of person who feels things deeply. And she does. But what most people don't see is how easily those feelings rearrange themselves around what she needs in the moment. I used to think Rebecca was just unlucky. 2 divorces by 32, jobs that never lasted more than a year or two, friendships that burned hot and then vanished in dramatic fallouts. Every ending came with a narrative. Someone betrayed her. Someone misunderstood her. Someone failed to appreciate her. My parents listened to every version. They analyzed, they sympathized, they stepped in. I watched, not from a place of jealousy, at least not consciously. I told myself I didn't want that kind of chaos in my life. I didn't want relationships that collapsed or jobs that imploded. I wanted stability. I wanted quiet. And so I built it. But stability doesn't attract rescue teams. Rebecca's crises always seemed urgent, immediate, flames licking at the edges of her life. Mine were internal, managed, contained. When she divorced her first husband, she called our parents sobbing at midnight. By morning, my father was renting a truck. My mother was packing boxes. I took a day off work to help, even though Rebecca barely looked at me. She clung to Mom, cried into her shoulder, told her she didn't know what she would do without her. I was there too, carrying furniture down narrow staircases, wrapping dishes in newspaper, handing over my credit card when she realized she couldn't cover the new apartment deposit in full. No one asked me to. It just felt automatic. That's the word I keep coming back to when I think about our dynamic automatic. Rebecca reacted. My parents responded. I adjusted. When she left her second marriage, the pattern repeated with minor variations. Different city, different excuses, same outcome. My parents framed it as Rebecca finding herself. They said she was passionate, that she refused to settle. They admired her intensity. I admired her too, sometimes. There's something seductive about living loudly, about not worrying whether your emotions inconvenience anyone else. But intensity without accountability leaves wreckage. 5 years ago, when she called me crying about her credit cards being maxed out, I believed it was another rough chapter that would pass. She sounded ashamed that night, truly ashamed. She said collectors were threatening legal action. She said she couldn't sleep. She said she felt like she was drowning. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in the dark, phone pressed to my ear, feeling that old instinct rise up in me. Fix it. Make it better. Don't let her spiral. The next morning, I transferred $8,000 into her account. She promised she would repay me, swore it was temporary, swore she would learn from it. Months passed. Then a year. Every time I hinted about repayment, she would deflect. I'm trying. Don't you trust me? Why are you keeping score? I told myself it wasn't worth the tension. I had a good job. I could recover. She needed it more. That was always the logic. She needed more. What I didn't see at the time were the smaller signs that something else was happening beneath the surface. A letter from a credit union about an inquiry I didn't remember making. A notification about a store account I was certain I hadn't opened. I assumed it was clerical error. I paid small balances just to avoid damage to my credit. I was meticulous about my financial health. I would never risk it. Looking back, I wonder how many times Rebecca tested the boundary before she crossed it fully. There's something important to understand about favoritism. It's rarely loud. It's rarely declared openly. It grows in small allowances, in who gets excused, in who gets corrected, in who gets comforted, and who gets praised for not needing comfort. My parents never said they loved Rebecca more. They just loved her louder. They rushed to her side. They defended her mistakes. They reframed her recklessness as sensitivity. And every time they did, they unknowingly reinforced a lesson. Rebecca's emotions matter most. Mine were manageable. When I told them about my diagnosis, I did it the way I do everything organized, calm, pre-processed. I explained the timeline, the treatment plan, the cost. I reassured them that I had savings, that I would handle it. My mother squeezed my hand and said she was proud of me for being so prepared. My father nodded and said, "You've always been the strong one." Rebecca tilted her head and asked which bank I used. It didn't feel suspicious in the moment. It felt practical. She asked about access, about backup plans, about what would happen if I was under anesthesia and something needed to be moved quickly. I answered every question, not because I was naive, because she was my sister. And because some part of me still wanted to believe that illness might soften her, that facing my mortality might remind her that we were on the same side. What I didn't understand was that Rebecca doesn't soften under pressure. She sharpens. By the time she showed up at my apartment with soup and concern in her eyes, she had already assessed the situation. She knew the amount in my account. She knew the urgency of my surgery. She knew my habits. She knew I trusted her. Rebecca has always been observant. She notices details people overlook, the location of keys, the tone of a password hint, the way someone hesitates before entering a PIN. I used to think that made her intuitive. Now I know it also made her dangerous. The hardest part of all this isn't admitting she stole from me. It's admitting that the conditions for that theft were cultivated over decades. She didn't wake up one morning and decide to become someone who could forge her sister's signature without flinching. She learned, slowly, that the world would rearrange itself around her needs. My parents rearranged their schedules. I rearranged my finances. Employers rearranged expectations. Why wouldn't she believe a bank teller could be rearranged too? By the time I lay in that hospital bed staring at the balance of $1,274, the story had already been unfolding for years. I just hadn't recognized the plot. Rebecca didn't see herself as cruel. That's the most unsettling part. In her mind, she was reallocating resources, using money that would otherwise go to waste. She framed it as practicality. Efficiency. She had already decided I might not survive. And in that calculation, her need for a new car outweighed my need for a fighting chance. That kind of thinking doesn't come from a single bad decision. It grows in soil where consequences are optional. And for most of her life, consequences had been optional, until they weren't. 5 years ago, I thought I had already learned the hardest lesson I would ever need to learn about my sister. It was a Tuesday night. I remember because I had an early meeting the next morning and I was already in bed when my phone rang just after midnight. Rebecca's name flashed on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something in me, the older sister reflex I had never been able to shake, made me answer. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. Words tumbled over each other. Credit cards, interest, collection agencies, threats to garnish wages. She said she felt like she couldn't breathe. She said she was embarrassed. She said she didn't know who else to call. That last sentence hit me the hardest. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding, listening to her spiral. She said she couldn't tell Mom and Dad because they had already done so much. She said she didn't want them to think she was a failure again. She kept repeating that word failure like it was stuck in her throat. I knew what that word felt like. I had worn it quietly after my divorce, even if no one else said it out loud. So when she said it, something inside me softened. "How much?" I asked. She hesitated. Then she told me, $8,000. It wasn't a random number. It was specific, carefully calculated, enough to clear the cards and stop the calls, enough to reset her. I didn't say yes immediately. I told her I would think about it. I hung up and sat there in the silence of my apartment, staring at the wall. I had been building my savings carefully for years by then. Every dollar had a purpose. Every account had a plan. 8,000 wasn't impossible, but it wasn't small either. Still, I couldn't shake the image of her alone in her apartment, crying into the phone. I couldn't shake the thought that if I didn't help, she would sink deeper. The next morning, before work, I transferred the money. She texted me a string of thank yous, promises, swore she would pay me back within the year, swore this was the wake-up call she needed, swore she was going to change. I believed her, not because I was naive, but because I wanted to believe that people learn when they hit bottom. I wanted to believe that this was her bottom. For a while, things seemed quieter. She stopped calling about collectors. She sounded more stable. I told myself it had worked, that I had helped her turn a corner. Months later, I brought up repayment gently, not accusatory, just a reminder. She stiffened immediately, said she was still catching up, said bringing it up made her feel small, said she thought I understood how hard she was trying. I dropped it. Not because I didn't need the money. I did, but because I didn't want to be the villain in her story. I didn't want to become another person who didn't understand her struggle. A. So I wrote it off in my mind as a lesson, a hard but manageable one. I told myself family sometimes costs you. That love isn't a ledger. What I didn't know was that I wasn't paying off her debt. I was unknowingly funding something else. Around that same time, I remember receiving a letter from a small credit union thanking me for my loan inquiry. I assumed it was a marketing mistake and ignored it. A few weeks later, I noticed a small fluctuation on my credit report, nothing dramatic, just a new line item that I didn't fully recognize. I meant to call and ask about it. I meant to investigate, but life got busy. Work demanded attention. Rebecca seemed calmer. I let it go. Then there was the car insurance notice that arrived months later, referencing a claim I didn't remember filing. I called the company, and they said it had already been resolved. I assumed there had been some clerical confusion. I paid a minor balance that appeared connected to it just to clear my credit. At the time, none of it felt like a pattern. It felt like background noise, administrative errors, the kind of minor inconveniences responsible adults fix without making a scene. I didn't realize I was patching over holes someone else was drilling. Looking back, I can see how carefully the groundwork was laid. Rebecca never jumped straight to catastrophic theft. She tested, observed, calculated what she could get away with, And because I didn't make noise, because I absorbed small irregularities quietly, she learned something dangerous. She learned I wouldn't look too closely. She learned I would prioritize peace over confrontation. She learned that I would rather doubt myself than accuse her. That $8,000 transfer wasn't just financial help, it was confirmation. Confirmation that when she cried, I responded. That when she framed herself as overwhelmed and ashamed, I would step in. That I was, at my core, predictable. And predictability can be exploited. There's something deeply uncomfortable about admitting that, about recognizing that my kindness may have functioned like training wheels for her behavior. But the truth is, patterns don't appear overnight. They are built through repetition. I helped her once. Then I overlooked inconsistencies. Then I chose silence over suspicion. By the time I was lying in that hospital bed years later, staring at my nearly empty account, Rebecca wasn't improvising. She was escalating. When I replay that midnight call in my head now, I hear things I missed at the time. The precision of the number, the way she emphasized that she couldn't tell mom and dad, the way she positioned me as her only safe option. It wasn't entirely false. She was overwhelmed. She was embarrassed. But she also understood something about me that I hadn't fully acknowledged about myself. I wanted to be needed. Not in the chaotic emergency way she was needed, but in the quiet, dependable way. I wanted to matter. And helping her made me feel like I did. That's the trap of being the responsible one. You don't ask for help, so when someone asks you for it, you step in eagerly. It feels like purpose. I never imagined that purpose could be weaponized. When the lawyer later uncovered the loan taken out in my name 5 years ago, $8,000, matching almost exactly the amount I believed I had given her, I felt the ground shift beneath me. I realized that the story I had told myself about that night might not have been entirely accurate, that perhaps I hadn't rescued her from debt. Perhaps she had created it in my name first. The possibility that she forged my signature even then, that she had already crossed that line long before my illness, reframed everything. It meant the midnight tears might have been part confession, part cover. I don't know if I will ever know the full truth about that night, whether she had already taken out the loan and needed my money to cover tracks, or whether she saw my willingness and later decided to test something bigger. What I do know is this: that first transfer changed the dynamic between us in a way I didn't recognize at the time. It shifted me from sister to safety net. And once someone learns, you will always catch them. They stop worrying about how hard they fall. 5 years later, when she walked into a bank crying about her dying sister and signed my name with a steady hand, she wasn't acting out of sudden desperation. She was following a pattern. A pattern that began the night I answered my phone at midnight and chose to believe that love alone could fix what accountability had never touched. If I had pushed harder then, maybe things would have been different, or maybe they wouldn't. But I can't rewrite that night. I can only tell you that it was the first crack in a foundation I thought was solid. And I didn't realize how deep that crack ran until everything built on top of it collapsed. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon, in an office that was too bright and too clean for the words that were about to be spoken inside it. I remember the hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint scent of disinfectant, the way the paper on the exam table crinkled when I shifted my weight. Doctor, Lewis sat across from me with a folder in his hands, his expression measured, careful. He didn't look alarmed. That was the first thing I noticed. He looked calm. "There's a mass," he said gently. "It's treatable. We caught it early enough, but it needs to come out." The word treatable echoed in my mind louder than mass. I clung to it. Treatable meant fixable. Treatable meant not hopeless. He explained the procedure, laparoscopic surgery, minimally invasive, a relatively short recovery time if everything went smoothly. But there was urgency in his tone. The tumor was growing faster than they liked. Waiting wasn't an option. 8 weeks at most, he said, preferably sooner. I nodded as if we were discussing a minor repair on a car, as if this were a scheduling inconvenience, not a threat living inside my body. I asked practical questions, risks, recovery time, work leave. I took notes. I did what I always do when something feels overwhelming. I turned it into a list. Then came the financial part. Even with insurance, the estimated cost would be around $47,000, a portion due before surgery. The rest arranged through billing. The number should have frightened me, but it didn't, because I had prepared. 15 years earlier, after my divorce, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would never again be in a position where someone else's decision could destabilize my life. I would build a cushion, a safety net, something solid that belonged only to me. So I started saving. I skipped vacations when coworkers traveled. I brought coffee from home instead of stopping at cafes. I said no to furniture upgrades, no to impulse purchases, no to things that sparkled but didn't last. Every year, I increased the automatic transfer into my savings account. It became a ritual, a form of discipline that felt almost sacred. I didn't tell anyone how much I had saved, not because it was a secret, but because it was personal. That fund wasn't just money, it was evidence. Evidence that my quiet, careful life mattered. Evidence that I could take care of myself. By the time I walked into that doctor's office, the balance had reached $52,000. More than enough. I remember sitting in my car afterward, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The world outside looked unchanged, cars moving, people crossing the street, sunlight bouncing off windows. How could everything look so normal when something inside me had shifted so profoundly? I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone right away. I drove home, made dinner, washed the dishes. I let the information settle slowly. That's how I process things quietly, internally. I don't explode. I absorb. A few days later, I told my parents and Rebecca at a family dinner. It wasn't a dramatic announcement. I waited until we were all seated, plates half full, conversation drifting between trivial topics. I have something to share, I said. Their faces turned toward me. Concern flickered across my mother's eyes when I mentioned the tumor. My father's jaw tightened slightly. Rebecca leaned forward. I explained the surgery, the timeline, the prognosis. I made sure to emphasize the good parts. They caught it early, I said. It's treatable. And then, because I didn't want anyone to worry about me financially, I added, I've saved enough to cover it. I remember the way my mother exhaled in relief. You've always been so responsible, she said. My father nodded. Good thing you planned ahead. Rebecca tilted her head, studying me with an expression I didn't fully understand at the time. Which bank are you using? She asked casually. What if you're too weak after surgery to handle transfers yourself? Do you have someone who can help if you're under anesthesia? Her questions felt practical, caring even. I felt oddly touched that she was thinking ahead for me. I have a backup ATM card at home, I said, just in case. And I wrote the PIN down in a notebook in my desk drawer. End quote. I laughed lightly as I said it. It sounded so organized, so prepared. I didn't notice the way her eyes sharpened, just for a second. The dinner moved on. Rebecca mentioned her car was having issues again. My parents discussed whether they could help her with repairs. The conversation drifted away from my surgery as quickly as it had landed there. I told myself that was fine. I didn't need them hovering. I didn't need panic. But as I drove home that night, watching streetlights blur past my windshield, I felt something small and heavy settle in my chest. I had just told my family that something inside me might kill me, and within minutes, the focus had shifted elsewhere. I tried not to read too much into it. I had spent years convincing myself that my independence was strength, that not needing people was admirable. But illness does something to you. It peels back layers you didn't realize were defenses. It makes you want to be held, even if you don't admit it out loud. That week, I began scheduling pre-surgery tests, blood work, imaging, consultations. My calendar filled with appointments. My body felt fine most days, which made the diagnosis feel abstract, like a technicality rather than a threat. At night, though, lying in bed alone, my mind wandered into darker territory. What if something went wrong? What if treatable wasn't as reassuring as it sounded? What if I had miscalculated? Then I would remind myself, you prepared for this. You saved. You did everything right. That savings account became my anchor. Whenever fear crept in, I would log into my banking app just to see the number, $52,000. A cushion, a promise, a guarantee that at least one part of this crisis was under control. I didn't know that the very act of reassuring my family about that control had already planted a seed. I didn't know that in mentioning my savings so casually, I had turned my lifeline into an opportunity. Looking back, that dinner feels like the hinge point, the moment where vulnerability met calculation, where my instinct to reassure collided with Rebecca's instinct to assess. But at the time, I walked away believing something simple. I would have surgery. I would recover. I would return to work. Life would resume its steady rhythm. The fund was there. The plan was in place. I had no idea that the greatest threat to my survival wasn't growing inside my body. It was already moving quietly through my apartment, memorizing details, waiting for the right moment to strike. 3 days after that dinner, Rebecca showed up at my apartment with a container of homemade soup and a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. I remember opening the door and being surprised. She rarely visited without a reason that centered around her. But this time, she stood there holding a canvas tote bag, hair pulled back loosely, wearing that expression people use when they're trying to look gentle. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "You shouldn't be alone right now. They're RTO win. It's contaction and win." It caught me off guard. Illness does something strange to pride. It makes even the most independent person want to be taken care of. Just a little. I had spent so long being the one who handled everything quietly that I didn't realize how much I craved someone else stepping in, even temporarily. "I'm okay," I said automatically. But she stepped past me anyway. "I know you are," she replied. "But that doesn't mean you have to do this by yourself. Use an elation." She moved through my kitchen like she belonged there, unpacking the soup, reheating it, setting a bowl in front of me without asking where anything was. She noticed the stack of medical paperwork on my counter. She noticed the pill bottles lined up neatly near the sink. She noticed everything. At the time, I interpreted that attention as care. Now, I see it differently. We sat at the small dining table, and for once, she didn't talk about herself. She asked about my symptoms, about the tests, about what the surgeon had said. She listened, nodding slowly, occasionally reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You've always been so strong," she said softly. "It's not fair that this is happening to you." I can't explain how powerful those words felt. Not because I needed validation for being strong, but because for the first time in a long time, she seemed to see me as the one in pain. That night, she insisted on staying over. "You shouldn't wake up alone if something feels wrong," she said. "Let me sleep on the couch." I hesitated for half a second. But I was tired. The kind of tired that sits in your bones when your body is fighting something you can't see. I was juggling appointments and work and the quiet fear that crept in during the early hours of the morning. So I said yes. She made tea before bed, adjusted the thermostat, asked where I kept extra blankets. I told her. When she asked casually about my bank again, just in case something happens during surgery, "Do you have everything set up?" I answered just as casually. "I have a backup ATM card in my desk drawer," I said, "and I wrote my PIN down in a notebook so I won't forget if I'm groggy from anesthesia." She laughed lightly. "Of course you did. You're so organized." It didn't register as odd. It sounded like admiration. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. Knowing someone was in the apartment eased something inside me. For once, I didn't feel like the only adult in the room. I didn't feel like the only one bracing for impact. When I woke up the next morning, the apartment was quiet. Rebecca was gone. There was a note on the counter in her handwriting. "Ran some errands. Call me if you need anything. Love you." I smiled when I read it. That's the part that still stings the most. Because I truly believed something had shifted between us. What I didn't know was that while I had been sleeping, she had moved through my apartment with careful precision. She knew exactly what she was looking for. Later, when I replayed that evening in my mind, I remembered small details that hadn't felt important at the time. The way she lingered near my desk. The way she asked casually if I still kept everything in the same place. The way she joked about how predictable I was. She found the backup ATM card in the top drawer. She found the small spiral notebook where I had written down my PNN along with a few other important reminders. She opened my wallet and took a picture of my driver's license. I didn't notice any of it, because why would I? The idea that my own sister would treat my home like a target never crossed my mind. I had grown up believing that family meant safety, even if it wasn't always warmth. When I think back to that night, I don't see a villain moving through shadows. I see my sister standing in my kitchen, stirring soup, telling me she loved me. And that's what makes the betrayal harder to swallow. 3 days later, I texted her to say thank you again for staying. She responded with a heart emoji and asked how I was feeling. Normal. That's how everything felt on the surface. Normal. But beneath that calm, something had already shifted. She had information now, access, time, and I had given it to her willingly. The hardest truth to accept wasn't that she stole from me. It was that she studied me first. She understood my routines, my habits, my blind spots. She knew I wouldn't immediately check my desk drawer. She knew I trusted her enough not to. In hindsight, the timing was deliberate. She came after the dinner where I revealed the amount in my savings. She stayed just long enough to gather what she needed. She left before I could suspect anything. There were no raised voices, no broken locks, no signs of intrusion, just quiet movement and quiet extraction. When people think about theft, they imagine force. They imagine breaking in. But sometimes theft looks like someone making you tea and tucking a blanket around your shoulders. Sometimes it looks like love. And the reason it works is because you don't question it. I went back to my routines, back to work, back to medical appointments. The surgery date was approaching. I felt the weight of it pressing closer each day, but I reassured myself constantly. You're prepared. You saved. You're ready. I had no idea that readiness had already been dismantled in the dark while I slept. I didn't know that my trust had been photographed, pocketed, and carried out of my apartment in a canvas tote bag. And when the moment finally came, when I opened my banking app in that hospital bed and saw that almost everything was gone, the shock wasn't just financial. It was existential, because the theft hadn't begun at the ATM. It had begun the night I opened my door and let my sister in, believing she had come to protect me. A week after Rebecca stayed over, the illusion finally shattered. Until then, I had no idea anything was wrong. I went to my pre-surgery appointments, endured blood draws and scans, signed consent forms with a steady hand. I told my coworkers I'd be out for a few weeks but would respond to emails if anything urgent came up. I folded laundry. I cleaned the apartment. I prepared. I remember thinking, oddly, that illness had simplified my life. Everything narrowed down to one goal: get through surgery, recover, return to normal. I held on to that like a rope. Then, in the middle of the night, the pain hit. It wasn't gradual. It was sharp and immediate, like something twisting inside me. I tried to breathe through it at first, sitting up in bed, pressing my palm against my abdomen as if I could physically hold the pain in place. But within minutes, I was sweating, shaking, struggling to stand. I called 911. The ambulance ride is blurred in my memory, flashes of overhead lights, the medic's steady voice asking questions, the cold vinyl of the stretcher beneath me. I remember thinking, through the haze, that this was happening faster than planned. The surgeon had warned me that the tumor might accelerate. I just hadn't expected it to do so this violently. At the hospital, they moved quickly. Blood tests, imaging, consults. The word urgent floated through the room more than once. By early morning, a doctor stood at my bedside and told me what I had feared. "We can't wait the full 8 weeks," he said. "We need to operate within 48 hours. 48 hours. I nodded. I felt strangely calm. Surgery was coming sooner than expected, but it was still surgery, still treatment, still survival. "There will be an upfront deposit," the hospital administrator explained gently. $25,000 before we schedule the operating room. And that was now the Morvan. "So, that's fine," I said automatically. I have savings. I even felt a flicker of pride saying it. They handed me the forms. A nurse adjusted my IV. I reached for my phone. I had done this before, logged into my banking app, just to reassure myself the money was there. It had become a ritual, a comfort. This time, it didn't comfort me. The screen loaded, and the number was wrong. I blinked, thinking maybe I had opened the wrong account. I refreshed, logged out, logged back in. The Wi-Fi icon flickered in the corner. Maybe it was lagging. It wasn't lagging. 1274元. The balance stared back at me like a taunt. I felt my throat close. My heart monitor began to beep faster, matching the spike in my pulse. I refreshed again, as if repetition might reverse it. I checked the transaction history. 4 ATM withdrawals, $10,000 each, consecutive days, and then an in-person withdrawal of $8,000. The dates aligned perfectly with the week after Rebecca stayed at my apartment. For a moment, my brain tried to protect me. Maybe it was fraud. Maybe someone hacked the account. Maybe this had nothing to do with her. Then I remembered the backup card, the notebook, the way she had asked questions about access and contingencies. I felt cold. I called the bank with shaking hands. The representative verified my identity and began listing the transactions in a steady, professional voice that felt completely disconnected from the chaos inside my chest. Yes, Miss Howard, we see 4 ATM withdrawals at the maximum daily limit. And there was also an in-branch withdrawal processed by one of our senior officers. In-branch? I whispered. Yes. The individual presented identification and signed for the funds. Signed. I was transferred to the officer who handled it. Mrs. Patterson. Her voice carried regret even before she finished explaining. She was very emotional, Mrs. Patterson said. She said her sister was dying and needed emergency treatment. She signed your name right in front of me. I should have examined it more closely, but she was convincing. My sister was dying. She had used my possible death as leverage. I felt something inside me fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, irreversible crack. When I hung up the phone, I didn't cry. I called Rebecca. She answered on the second ring, her voice casual. Oh, she said when I told her what the bank had explained. You found out. It wasn't a question. Rebecca, I said, my voice barely steady. That money was for my surgery. She exhaled sharply, almost impatiently. Michelle, come on, she said. You think you're going to live long enough to spend it? I needed a car. Mine completely died. I can't get to work without one. My vaso. My vision blurred for a second. You stole $50,000, I said. I borrowed it, she corrected. And honestly, you're overreacting. If something happens to you, what's the point of it just sitting there? There are moments in life when time slows down, not in a cinematic way, but in a painful, hyper-aware way. I could hear the faint hum of hospital machinery, the murmur of nurses in the hallway, the mechanical beep of my monitor tracking a heart that suddenly felt too fragile for the conversation it was enduring. You're saying, I said slowly, that because I might die, you decided to spend the money that would help me live. Silence. Then she laughed, not nervously, not uncertainly, dismissively. You're being dramatic, she said. Mom and Dad will help if it's really that serious. They always figure things out. That sentence landed harder than anything else she had said. Mom and Dad will help, not you, not me, them, as if I were already removed from the equation. After we hung up, I stared at the ceiling. The white tiles above me looked endless, sterile, indifferent. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was the calculation. She had done the math. She had weighed my survival against her inconvenience and decided the risk was acceptable. And beneath that calculation was something even colder confidence. Confidence that I would forgive her. Confidence that I would stay quiet. Confidence that I would absorb the damage the way I always had. But lying there, IV in my arm, surgery scheduled within 48 hours, something shifted inside me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about how to fix things quietly. I was thinking about consequences. Because this wasn't a missed repayment. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft. forgery, fraud, and it had happened while I was preparing to fight for my life. The nurse returned to check my vitals. She asked if I was okay. I nodded automatically, even though nothing felt okay. Inside, fear and clarity were colliding. I didn't know yet how I would pay the deposit. I didn't know how I would face my parents when they inevitably defended her. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I survived this surgery, I would not survive it as the same person. The safety net had been cut, and for the first time, I had no intention of stitching it back together. After I hung up on Rebecca, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my parents, and I let them hear the fear in my voice. Not the calm, organized version of me, not the daughter who presents solutions before problems. I told them exactly what had happened. I told them my account was nearly empty. I told them Rebecca had admitted to taking the money. I told them surgery was scheduled within 48 hours and the hospital needed a deposit. I expected shock. I expected outrage. I expected at least one of them to say, "We'll fix this." Instead, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. My mother was the first to speak. "Rebecca's had a very hard few years," she said carefully. "You know how she struggles. Maybe there's some misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," I replied. "She told me she took it. She said I might not live long enough to use it." Another pause. My father's voice came through, distant but steady. "Michelle, you've always been the strong one. You'll figure something out. Maybe we can all sit down and talk about this calmly." Calmly. As if this were a disagreement over dinner plans. "I need $25,000 in the next 2 days," I said, "or my surgery doesn't happen." "We don't have that kind of money sitting around," my mother answered quickly. "You know that. We just helped Rebecca with her car situation last month." I felt something inside me hollow out. They didn't ask how I was feeling. They didn't say they were coming to the hospital. They didn't even ask if I was alone. They simply repositioned the situation into something manageable, something less urgent, something that didn't require them to choose. "I have to go," my mother said after a moment. "Rebecca's calling on the other line." And just like that, the conversation ended. I stared at my phone for a long time. It wasn't that I expected them to produce money they didn't have. It was the tone, the absence of urgency, the assumption that I would, as always, find a way to absorb the shock. I lay back against the hospital pillow and let the ceiling fill my vision. For 36 years, I had protected them from my needs. Now, when I needed something that couldn't be minimized or postponed, they defaulted to the same script. "You're strong. You'll handle it." That night, I didn't sleep much. The pain medication dulled the physical ache, but my mind refused to quiet down. I replayed my childhood through a new lens. Every time I had been praised for being low maintenance, every time Rebecca's chaos had become a family emergency while my achievements were treated as expected. It wasn't that they didn't love me, it was that they trusted me to endure. And endurance can look a lot like invisibility. The next morning, the hospital administrator returned to discuss the deposit again. I forced myself to sit up straighter. "There's been some fraud," I explained carefully. "I'm working with the bank. I may need a little time." Her expression shifted, not judgmental, just cautious. "We do require the deposit before scheduling the operating room," she said. "But if there are extenuating circumstances, we can explore options." Options. That word felt fragile, but it was something. After she left, I stared at my phone again. For a moment, the old instinct resurfaced. Maybe I should call Rebecca back. Maybe if I appealed to her emotionally, if I reminded her that this wasn't theoretical, she would reverse the transfer. Maybe she would come to her senses. But I already knew the answer. She had already weighed my life against her convenience. She had already decided. So instead of calling her, I called someone else. The hospital's legal department. It felt dramatic, even as I dialed, like I was escalating something that should have stayed within the family. But this was no longer a family disagreement. It was identity theft, forgery, fraud. A woman answered, her voice calm and professional. I explained who I was, what had happened, and that I was currently admitted awaiting urgent surgery. She didn't interrupt. She didn't question my credibility. She simply listened. We'll assign someone to review this immediately, she said. Given the timeline, we'll prioritize it. And also do as... When I hung up, my hands were still shaking, but the feeling was different from before. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was resolve. Fighting back meant making this real. It meant admitting that my sister hadn't just taken money, she had potentially endangered my life. It meant accepting that my parents might never stand fully on my side. But it also meant I was done absorbing. Later that afternoon, a hospital social worker visited my room. She asked gentle questions about my support system, about finances, about whether I felt safe. For the first time, I said something out loud that I had never fully acknowledged before. I don't think my family sees me clearly, I said. She nodded slowly. Sometimes, she replied, people get so used to someone being strong that they forget strength has limits. That sentence settled into me. Strength has limits. I had been operating as if mine didn't. By evening, I received a call from someone in the legal department confirming that they had already contacted the bank for documentation. They asked detailed questions about access, about the backup card, about who knew my PIN. I answered everything. Each answer felt like peeling back a layer of denial. Yes, she stayed at my apartment. Yes, I told her where the card was. Yes, she knew the amount. The lawyer's voice remained steady. We will investigate thoroughly, he said. If criminal conduct is confirmed, there will be consequences. Consequences. Rebecca had lived most of her life without them. Mistakes were smoothed over. Debts were absorbed. Stories were rewritten. But this time, the paperwork had timestamps, signatures, surveillance footage. This time, it wasn't just about family dynamics. It was about the law. As night fell, I lay in the dim hospital room, listening to the soft, mechanical rhythm of machines around me. The fear of surgery was still there, hovering quietly. But it had been joined by something else. Clarity. I finally understood something I had avoided for years. I wasn't just the responsible one. I was the buffer, the shock absorber, the one who took impact so the rest of the family could continue as if nothing had happened. And that role had nearly cost me everything. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about reconciliation. I wasn't thinking about how to preserve peace. I was thinking about survival in every sense of the word. If I made it through surgery, I wasn't going back to the version of myself who answered midnight calls without question. I wasn't going back to the sister who quietly transferred money and swallowed resentment. The tumor was something doctors could remove. But the pattern in my family, that was something I would have to cut out myself. And this time, I wasn't afraid of the scar. The surgery happened exactly 48 hours after the pain sent me to the emergency room. In some strange way, the theft faded into the background for a few hours as doctors and nurses moved around me with quiet efficiency. Consent forms were signed. Lines were checked. A nurse squeezed my hand and told me to think about something peaceful as the anesthesiologist adjusted the IV. I remember staring at the ceiling lights as they blurred, thinking how surreal it was that my body could betray me and my family could betray me at the same time. It felt excessive, like life had decided one crisis wasn't enough. When I woke up, my throat was dry and my abdomen ached in a deep, heavy way. But I was alive. The first thing I noticed was the absence of the sharp, twisting pain that had driven me to call 911. The second thing I noticed was how quiet the room felt. No family gathered by the bed, no familiar faces waiting anxiously for news. Just a nurse adjusting my monitor. The surgery went well, she said softly. The tumor was removed. The doctor will come by later. Relief didn't come in a wave. It came in fragments. I was alive. That mattered. But survival felt incomplete. My body had been repaired, but my life was still in pieces. Later that afternoon, a man in his mid-50s walked into my room with a leather folder tucked under his arm. He introduced himself as David Morrison from the hospital's legal department. He pulled a chair close to the bed and spoke in a calm, measured tone. Miss Howard, I understand you've experienced significant financial fraud connected to your treatment fund. I'm very sorry you're dealing with this during recovery. I nodded. Even speaking felt tiring. He began asking questions. Detailed ones. When had Rebecca stayed at my apartment? Where exactly was the backup card kept? How was the PIN recorded? Had there been previous irregularities in my financial history? As he asked, I realized something unsettling. This might not have been the first time. I thought there were small issues before, I admitted. Credit inquiries, a loan notice once. I dismissed them. He didn't react with judgment. He simply wrote things down. We've obtained preliminary documentation from the bank, he continued. There are 4 ATM withdrawals over 2 consecutive days, maximum daily limit each time. Additionally, there was an in-branch withdrawal of $8,000 with a forged signature. Forged. Hearing the word in a legal context felt heavier than when I had whispered it to myself. Morrison flipped open the folder and showed me a copy of the withdrawal slip. My name was written in steady, confident handwriting. It almost looked like mine, close enough that a distracted teller might not question it. Most first-time forgeries show hesitation, he said. Irregular pressure, shaky lines. This one does not. The implication settled slowly. She had done this before. Over the next few days, as I recovered in the hospital, Morrison and his team began piecing together a timeline. Bank surveillance footage showed a woman in a baseball cap at the ATM on the days of the withdrawals. Her face was partially obscured, but the frame caught something unmistakable on her wrist. A small butterfly tattoo. Rebecca had gotten it on her 21st birthday. I had gone with her to the studio. I remembered holding her hand when the needle first touched her skin. Seeing that same butterfly frozen on security footage made my stomach twist. Morrison also uncovered something I hadn't expected. 5 years earlier, around the time of the midnight call about her credit card debt, there had been a credit union loan taken out in my name for $8,000. The address listed for correspondence was Rebecca's old apartment. I stared at the document when he showed it to me. I thought I gave her that money, I whispered. It appears, he said carefully, that she may have taken out the loan first, and when the debt appeared on your credit report, you paid it off. I felt dizzy. That meant the narrative I had held onto for years that I rescued her might not have been true at all. She may have created the debt under my name and then relied on my silence to cover it. There were other discrepancies, too. A small insurance claim filed under my name 3 years ago. A store credit account opened without my knowledge and later sent to collections, one I had paid off just to protect my credit score. Each one small enough to ignore individually. Together, they formed a pattern. A decade of quiet extraction. Rebecca hadn't just stolen from me when I was sick. She had been siphoning from me for years. When Morrison explained the legal implications, identity fraud, forgery, theft by deception, I felt a complicated mixture of vindication and grief. Vindication that I wasn't imagining things. Grief that the person responsible was my own sister. I need you to understand, Morrison said gently, that pursuing this will have consequences. Potentially criminal ones. I closed my eyes. For 36 years, I had protected Rebecca from consequences. I had softened stories, covered debts, kept quiet when something didn't add up. And where had that led? To a hospital bed, to nearly losing my surgery, to a sister who laughed at the possibility of my death. I'm not trying to destroy her life, I said slowly. I just want my life back. He nodded. That's exactly what this process is for. During recovery, my parents visited once. They looked smaller than I remembered. My mother avoided direct eye contact when the topic of Rebecca surfaced. My father asked about my pain level and then shifted the conversation to practical matters. Maybe this can still be handled privately, he suggested. No need to make things public. Public. As if secrecy had ever protected me. She forged my name, I said quietly. More than once. He sighed heavily but didn't argue further. When they left, I felt an unexpected lightness. Not because the situation was resolved, it wasn't, but because something had finally shifted inside me. The truth was no longer something I carried alone. There were documents now. Footage. Expert analysis. A record that couldn't be dismissed as sibling drama. For the first time, Rebecca's actions weren't filtered through family narrative. They were measured against the law. And the law doesn't care who was always called the strong one. As my stitches healed and I took my first careful walks down the hospital hallway, I realized survival meant more than removing a tumor. It meant removing the silence that had allowed everything else to grow unchecked. Rebecca had believed she could calculate my death into her plans. She had not calculated evidence. She had not calculated that I would stop protecting her. And as the case moved forward, piece by piece, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not even revenge. Clarity. For the first time in my life, I wasn't absorbing the damage. I was documenting it. Rebecca didn't panic when the legal paperwork reached her. That was the part that stunned me most. 3 days after she was formally served bank accounts frozen, injunction placed on the SUV, notice of civil action filed, my phone lit up with her name over and over again. 10 missed calls in less than an hour. Then a string of messages. Michelle, what are you doing? This is insane. Call me back right now. I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, silence didn't mean surrender. It meant preparation. 2 days later, she showed up at the hospital unannounced. I was there for a follow-up appointment, still moving slowly, still sore but recovering well. I was sitting in the waiting area when I saw her reflection in the glass doors. She had parked the new SUV directly in front of the window, positioned so I would see it. She walked in with that same confident stride she'd always had, chin lifted slightly, as if she were entering a social gathering rather than a building where her sister had nearly lost her life. "Nice car, right?" she said as she dropped into the chair beside me without invitation. "You should really see it in sunlight." I didn't look at her. "I have," I said quietly. She leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Her tone wasn't apologetic. It wasn't even defensive. It was almost playful. "You really escalated things," she continued. "Freezing my accounts? Getting lawyers involved? That's extreme." Extreme. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling. Inside my bag, my phone was recording. Morrison had suggested I document any interaction from this point forward. "You took my medical fund," I said. "You weren't using it," she replied immediately. "And you're fine." The surgery worked, so clearly it all worked out. It all worked out. The casualness of it made my chest tighten more than the original theft had. She spoke as if the outcome justified the method, as if my survival validated her gamble. "What if it hadn't?" I asked. She shrugged. "Mom and Dad would have figured something out. They always do. And honestly, you act like I robbed a stranger. We're family." "Family." The word felt hollow. "You forged my signature," I said. She rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, Michelle, don't say it like that. I signed your name because it was easier. I had your ID. It's not like I hacked into the Pentagon." There it was. No denial. No confusion. Just normalization. For years, Rebecca had survived on the assumption that her behavior would be reframed as impulsive, emotional, forgivable. She believed context softened crime. She leaned closer, lowering her voice slightly. "Are you really going to drag this through court?" she asked. "You know how this looks. Mom's already a mess. Dad can barely sleep. You're going to destroy the family over money?" "Over money." I let that sit between us for a moment. "It wasn't just money," I said slowly. "It was my surgery." She sighed dramatically. "You're being dramatic. You always go straight to worst-case scenarios. You think you were dying, but you weren't. You're alive. You're fine." There it was again. The minimization. The quiet rewriting of reality. "You said I probably wouldn't make it," I reminded her. She hesitated for half a second. "I was upset," she said quickly. "I didn't mean it like that. You take everything so literally." I looked at her then, really looked at her. There was no guilt in her eyes, only irritation, frustration that I had stepped outside the script. "You laughed," I said. She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted tactics. "Look," she said, her tone softening artificially. "I was desperate. My car was dead. I couldn't get to work. You know how unstable things have been for me. I needed something reliable. You always land on your feet. You've got the hospital backing you. Promotions. Stability. I don't." For a moment, a flicker of old instinct rose inside me, the part of me trained to calculate her vulnerabilities, to understand them, to soften. But something had changed. "You decided my life was negotiable," I said. She scoffed. "That's dramatic." "No," I replied, "that's accurate." Silence stretched between us. The waiting room buzzed faintly around us, names being called, footsteps crossing tile floors, the hum of fluorescent lights. Rebecca leaned back again, her expression hardening. "You're not actually going to let this go to trial," she said flatly. "Mom and Dad would never forgive you." There it was. Not "I'm sorry," not "I was wrong," but "they'll blame you." She stood up then, smoothing her jacket. "Call the lawyer and fix this," she said. "We can work something out privately. I'll make payments. Eventually. Eventually. Like the $8,000 from 5 years ago. Like the credit inquiries. Like the insurance claim. Like the decade of quiet withdrawals from a sister who never checked too closely. You don't get to decide the timeline anymore," I said calmly. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. "You're serious," she said. "Yes." Her jaw tightened. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. As she stepped outside, the sunlight hit the SUV she had purchased with my medical fund. It gleamed, polished, untouched by consequence. But inside the courtroom that was coming, it would not gleam. Inside that courtroom, there would be footage, bank records, a handwriting expert explaining how confident forgeries look when someone has practiced, a senior bank officer describing how she had been manipulated by tears about a dying sister. And there would be this conversation, recorded. When I replayed it later for Morrison, he listened without interrupting. When it ended, he closed his folder slowly. "She believes she's untouchable," he said. "She's always been," I replied. But something had shifted. Rebecca's confidence wasn't built on innocence. It was built on history, on the assumption that I would absorb, forgive, protect. She hadn't accounted for documentation. She hadn't accounted for the fact that this time, I had nearly lost everything. As I left the hospital that day, walking carefully toward my car, I felt something settle inside me, not rage, not vengeance, finality. For years, Rebecca had mistaken my silence for weakness. She had mistaken my stability for endless capacity. She had mistaken my love for permission. And now, for the first time in her life, she was about to learn what it meant when the person who always fixes things decides to stop. Court wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth, once placed under oath, doesn't bend for family narratives. It stands. And this time, so would I. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. For weeks, I had imagined something grand, high ceilings, dramatic lighting, the kind of setting where truth thundered. Instead, it was fluorescent lights, wood-paneled walls, and rows of narrow benches that felt almost too ordinary for what was about to unfold. But maybe that was fitting. The damage Rebecca caused wasn't dramatic at first. It was quiet, administrative, paperwork and signatures and small decisions made behind closed doors. It made sense that the reckoning would happen in a room that looked just as unremarkable. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Morrison, my hands folded tightly in my lap. My body was still healing. There was a faint pull beneath my ribs when I shifted in my seat, a reminder that I had survived something far more physical than this. Across the aisle, Rebecca sat next to her attorney, dressed carefully, hair smooth, makeup subtle. She looked composed. Behind her, my parents sat together. That was the part that hurt more than I expected. They weren't sitting behind me. They weren't neutral. They were behind her. My mother's shoulders were tense, her hands clasped in her lap. My father stared straight ahead, jaw tight. They looked older than they had a month earlier, smaller somehow. When the judge entered, everyone rose. The room settled into a heavy silence. Morrison began methodically. First, the bank records. 4 ATM withdrawals, $10,000 each on consecutive days. The dates aligned precisely with the week after Rebecca had stayed at my apartment. The transaction times matched her usual lunch break schedule. The locations were within a 5-mile radius of her office. Then came the footage. The screen in the courtroom flickered to life, showing grainy video from an ATM camera. A woman in a baseball cap stepped into frame. The angle obscured her face, but when she reached forward to collect the cash, the camera caught her wrist clearly. The butterfly tattoo. I felt my breath catch. I had gone with her to get that tattoo. I remembered the way she gripped my hand and laughed nervously as the artist traced the outline. I remembered telling her it would be there forever. Now it was there in evidence. Her attorney objected briefly, questioning clarity, but the judge overruled him. The image was unmistakable. Next came the handwriting expert. She explained calmly how forged signatures often show hesitation, uneven pressure, trembling strokes. She enlarged both my authentic signature and the one used for the in-branch withdrawal. "This," she said, pointing to the forged version, "is confident, practiced. There is no visible uncertainty." Practiced. The word hung in the air like smoke. Morrison then presented documentation from 5 years earlier, a credit union loan for $8,000 taken out in my name. The address listed for contact was Rebecca's former apartment. My signature appeared on the application. It wasn't mine. I felt something twist in my chest, not surprise, but confirmation. The midnight call, the tears, the transfer. It all rearranged itself into a new shape in my mind. I hadn't rescued her from debt. I had unknowingly paid off my own fraud. There were additional records. A small insurance claim filed under my name. A retail credit account opened without my consent and later sent to collections. Each incident small enough to ignore alone. Together, they formed a pattern stretching back nearly a decade. A pattern of access. A pattern of assumption. A pattern of consequence-free taking. When Morrison played the recording from the hospital waiting room, the one where Rebecca casually justified the theft, the courtroom shifted perceptibly. Her voice filled the space, light and dismissive. "You weren't using it. You're overreacting. You're fine." The judge's expression hardened. Rebecca's attorney objected again, calling the recording inflammatory, but the objection was denied. It was admissible. For the first time since the proceedings began, Rebecca looked at me directly. Not with guilt, not even with anger, with disbelief, as if she truly had not expected me to follow through. When the judge asked if anyone wished to make a statement, there was a long pause. Then my mother stood. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bench in front of her. "We didn't know," she said, her voice cracking. "We didn't want to know." The admission felt like a quiet earthquake. She didn't defend Rebecca. She didn't deny the evidence. She didn't even look at her. She looked at me. For the first time in my life, I saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before: regret, without excuse. My father remained seated but spoke anyway. "We failed you," he said simply. The room was silent. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. But it was real. For 36 years, I had waited to hear something like that, not because I needed apology to function, but because I needed acknowledgement. The judge delivered her ruling calmly. Full restitution of $48,000, plus interest and legal fees. Immediate seizure and auction of the SUV to recover funds. The case formally referred to the county prosecutor's office for potential criminal charges of forgery and identity fraud. Rebecca's composure broke then. She began to cry, not the theatrical sobbing I had grown used to, but something sharper, desperate, frantic. "Michelle," she said, turning toward me, "please, tell them it's a misunderstanding. You don't have to do this." For a brief second, I felt the old instinct rise again, the urge to de-escalate, to smooth, to step in and prevent consequences. But I didn't move. There was nothing left to protect. Outside the courthouse, the air felt strangely clean. Autumn sunlight filtered through thinning leaves, casting long shadows across the steps. My parents approached me slowly. My mother reached for my hand. "Can you forgive us?" she asked. It was the question I had once believed would fix everything, but forgiveness felt too simple for what had happened. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I need time. Time to understand how deep the silence had gone. Time to separate love from enabling. Time to exist without being the buffer." Rebecca stood a short distance away, speaking urgently with her attorney. For the first time, she looked uncertain, not because she had been exposed, but because she had been held accountable. And as I stood there, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the faint ache of healing stitches beneath my clothes, I realized something quietly profound. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about money. It was about ending a pattern. For years, I had been the one who absorbed impact so the rest of my family could remain intact. Today, I didn't absorb. I testified. And for the first time, the story was no longer being rewritten to protect someone else. It was being recorded exactly as it happened. No excuse, no minimization, no more silence. 2 months after the civil ruling, the phone call came from the county prosecutor's office. I was at home, standing in my small kitchen, staring out at the park behind my apartment as late afternoon light filtered through the trees. Recovery had been steady. The stitches were gone. The swelling had faded. I had returned to work part-time, easing back into spreadsheets and budget meetings like someone relearning how to inhabit her own life. When my phone rang and I saw the unfamiliar number, something in my chest tightened. I knew what it was before I answered. "This is Assistant Prosecutor Daniels," the voice said after introductions. "We've completed our review of the evidence related to your sister. Based on the documentation, we are moving forward with criminal charges, 2 counts of forgery, and 1 count of identity fraud." There it was. Official, recorded, no longer theoretical. Rebecca was facing potential prison time. After I hung up, I stood very still. I had imagined this moment in fragments, imagined feeling vindicated, triumphant, even relieved. Instead, what I felt was heavy. Not regret, not doubt. Just the weight of finality. Within an hour, my phone began lighting up. First my mother, then my father, then Rebecca herself. Calls layered over one another like overlapping alarms. I didn't answer at first. Then a message came from my mother. "Please, call us. This has gone too far." I exhaled slowly and pressed dial. My parents arrived at my apartment that evening without waiting for an invitation. They had driven 3 hours, my mother said, barely pausing to breathe as she spoke. She looked exhausted, eyes red-rimmed. My father stood just behind her, shoulders stooped in a way I hadn't noticed before. "Michelle," my mother began, stepping inside. "She's your sister. Prison will ruin her life." I closed the door quietly. "She ruined her own life," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "She made mistakes," my father said sharply. "But this is criminal court. This isn't some family disagreement." Exactly, I thought. For years, everything had been framed as misunderstanding, as miscommunication, as emotional overreaction. Now it had language that couldn't be softened. Forgery, identity fraud. My mother reached for my hand, but I didn't take it. "She's terrified," she said. She didn't think it would go this far. I couldn't help the small, humorless laugh that escaped me. "She didn't think it would go this far, because it never has," I said. "Not once in her life." Silence settled between us. For a long time, I had been the bridge in this family, the one who absorbed tension and translated it into something manageable. I had smoothed conversations, softened truths, kept everyone facing roughly the same direction. Now I stood still and let the discomfort exist. "You survived," my father said finally. "The surgery went well. You're back at work. The money's being repaid. Isn't that enough?" I felt the familiar pull of that argument, the idea that survival should cancel harm, that because I was alive, everything else could be minimized. "No," I said quietly, "it's not." For 10 years, Rebecca had used my identity as a resource. She had opened accounts in my name, taken loans, filed claims, and when I was facing surgery, when I was vulnerable in a way I had never been before, she took what was meant to protect me. And she laughed. "I'm not asking for prison," I continued. "I didn't file the charges. The evidence did. The prosecutor did. I'm not pursuing this because I hate her. I'm pursuing it because I'm done protecting her." My mother's face crumpled slightly. "You're going to destroy this family," she whispered. That sentence landed differently now than it once would have. "This family," I replied carefully, "has been destroying me quietly for years." The words felt strange, leaving my mouth honest and unfiltered. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't crying. I was simply stating something I had finally allowed myself to understand. Rebecca had learned early that someone would always intervene, that if consequences appeared, they would be negotiated away. She didn't fear legal boundaries because she had never truly encountered them, and I had helped build that illusion. When my parents finally left that evening, the apartment felt unusually still. Not lonely, just quiet in a way that felt intentional. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the small kitchen table where Rebecca had once stirred soup and asked about my bank. I thought about forgiveness. It would have been easier, in some ways, to drop the charges, to call the prosecutor and say I didn't want to cooperate further, to return to the familiar pattern of minimizing harm for the sake of peace. But peace built on denial isn't peace. It's postponement. A week later, Rebecca pleaded guilty. Her attorney had advised it. The evidence was overwhelming: bank footage, handwriting analysis, the recorded conversation, the pattern of prior fraud. Fighting it would only increase penalties. At sentencing, the courtroom felt different than it had during the civil hearing. Quieter, more contained. The judge sentenced her to 18 months of probation, 150 hours of community service, mandatory financial counseling, and full restitution. No prison time, but a felony conviction on her record. When the gavel struck, Rebecca looked smaller, not broken, not transformed, just confronted. As we exited the courtroom, she caught my eye. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said softly. I studied her face. There were tears there now, but they weren't dramatic. They were exhausted. "It didn't start far," I replied. "It started small, and you kept going." She didn't argue. For the first time in my life, she didn't argue. In the months that followed, life began rearranging itself in quieter ways. The hospital promoted me to senior financial analyst. My performance during recovery, they said, demonstrated resilience and leadership. I accepted the promotion without self-deprecation for once. I moved to a new apartment with a small balcony overlooking a park. I bought a plant and placed it where the morning sun could reach it. I started taking evening walks not to escape, but simply because I wanted to. My parents called less often. When they did, the conversations were tentative, cautious, as if they were learning a new language. Rebecca began her community service. She attended counseling. She made restitution payments. I didn't monitor her progress obsessively. I didn't need to. The point had never been revenge. It had been clarity. For the first time in 36 years, I was not the shock absorber. I was not the silent fixer. I was not the resource that absorbed damage so others could remain comfortable. I was simply a person who had drawn a line. And in drawing it, I didn't destroy my family. I disrupted a pattern. There's a difference. Standing on my balcony one quiet Sunday morning, coffee warm in my hands, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't hate Rebecca. I didn't even feel anger anymore. What I felt was distance. Healthy distance. I no longer needed her to change for me to be okay. I no longer needed my parents' validation to feel legitimate. I no longer needed to prove I was strong by enduring harm quietly. Strength, I had learned, isn't about how much you can absorb. It's about knowing when to stop absorbing. And as the leaves shifted in the park below, catching the light in quiet gold and red, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on everyone else behaving well. The solid kind that comes from finally choosing yourself. 6 months after the sentencing, my life didn't look dramatically different from the outside. I still woke up early. I still made coffee in the same chipped mug I'd had for years. I still drove to the same hospital, walked through the same glass doors, nodded to the same security guard at the entrance. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. The tumor was gone. My follow-up scans were clear. My doctor told me there was every reason to believe I would live a long, healthy life. Every time I heard that, I felt gratitude, but also a strange awareness that survival had come at a cost that wasn't only medical. The restitution process had moved quickly once the SUV was seized and auctioned. Watching the vehicle that had once gleamed in front of the hospital reduced to a line item on a legal report felt less satisfying than I had imagined. It wasn't about the car. It was about what it represented, a choice Rebecca had made while I lay in a hospital bed. The money was returned to my account. Seeing the balance restored to what it once was should have felt like a reset, but it didn't feel the same. It felt different, not tainted, exactly, just transformed. The numbers no longer symbolized only discipline and preparation. They symbolized boundaries, documentation, consequence. At work, something unexpected happened. The hospital administration, aware of the legal case and the way I had handled it, promoted me to senior financial analyst. They cited resilience, leadership under pressure, integrity. It was the first promotion I had received in 9 years. I accepted it without apologizing for it. That, in itself, was new. For years, I had downplayed my achievements. I had framed stability as luck, diligence as obligation. Now, when colleagues congratulated me, I simply said thank you. I moved to a new apartment a month later. Not far, just across town. It was smaller, but it had a balcony overlooking a quiet park. The first morning I stood there with a cup of coffee, I noticed how light fell across the trees in a way I had never paid attention to before. I bought a small plant and placed it by the railing. Watering it became a ritual. Simple, intentional, mine. Rebecca began her probation quietly. Mandatory financial counseling, community service hours logged and verified. The felony conviction followed her like a shadow she couldn't outrun. We didn't speak, not because a court order demanded it, but because silence felt necessary. For once, it wasn't heavy. It was protective. My parents adjusted slowly. The first few weeks after sentencing were tense. Phone calls were cautious. Conversations skirted around the subject of Rebecca. My mother would mention the weather. My father would ask about work. Neither of them pushed me to reconsider the charges anymore. I think, for the first time, they understood that pushing would cost them something real. One afternoon, about 3 months after the trial, my father asked to meet me for coffee. Just the two of us. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. He looked tired, but not defensive. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause, "about how often we told you that you were strong." I waited. "I think we mistook strength for capacity," he continued. "We assumed you could handle more, so we gave you more." It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was awareness. "That's what it felt like," I said. He nodded slowly. "We should have protected you too." Hearing that didn't fix anything instantly, but it shifted something subtle and important. It meant the narrative had changed. It meant the truth had finally entered the conversation without being deflected. My mother struggled longer. Her instinct was still to smooth, to mediate, to ask whether time might soften everything. I told her gently that time doesn't erase patterns, it reveals them. "I'm not cutting you off," I said once, when she looked frightened at the thought. "I'm just not absorbing everything anymore." She didn't fully understand it yet, but she was trying. Rebecca, on the other hand, sent a letter. 6 pages long, handwritten, carefully composed. She apologized. Repeatedly. She described feeling lost and pressured and in a dark place. She said she never intended to hurt me. She asked for another chance. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it in a drawer. I didn't respond. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't require immediate communication. It doesn't require performance. It can exist quietly, without proximity. I didn't feel rage anymore. That had burned out months earlier. What I felt instead was distance. Clean, defined distance. Somewhere in the city, Rebecca was learning what accountability feels like. Somewhere else, my parents were learning how to relate to me without assuming I would cushion every impact. And I was learning how to live without being anyone's safety net. That phrase, safety net, had defined me for most of my life. I had been the backup plan, the reliable one, the person who absorbed financial missteps and emotional fallout alike. Now, when something went wrong in my family, I didn't immediately reach for my wallet or my calendar. I paused. I assessed. I chose. The difference between absorbing and choosing is subtle, but it changes everything. One evening, as I walked through the park behind my apartment, I passed a group of children running across the grass. One of them tripped. Another reached down and helped her up. They laughed and kept moving. It struck me how natural that interaction was. Support offered freely, help given, but not at the cost of self. That's what I had misunderstood for years. Support doesn't mean surrender. Love doesn't mean unlimited access. Family doesn't mean exemption from consequence. The real victory wasn't the restitution. It wasn't the promotion. It wasn't even the legal outcome. It was the freedom. The freedom to choose who I let into my apartment, who I shared financial information with, who I trusted with vulnerability. The freedom to say no without explanation. The freedom to exist without constantly bracing for impact. On a quiet Sunday morning, months after everything had settled, I received a text from Mrs. Patterson, the bank officer who had processed Rebecca's fraudulent withdrawal. She had retired. "Coffee sometime?" she wrote. "I think we understand each other." I smiled at the simplicity of it. Two women who had been manipulated by the same story, one about a dying sister, now connected not by betrayal, but by clarity. "Yes," I replied. "I'd like that." End quote. Sitting on my balcony later that day, watching sunlight move across the park, I thought about how close I had come to losing more than money, losing more than health. I had nearly lost myself. For years, I had shaped my identity around being strong enough for everyone else, around being the person who could endure quietly and keep things functional. Now, strength looked different. It looked like boundaries. It looked like documentation. It looked like standing in a courtroom and letting the truth unfold without stepping in to soften it. It looked like watering a small plant each morning because I wanted to, not because someone else needed me to. Rebecca's choices altered the course of my life, but they didn't define it. What defined it was what I did next. And what I did next was choose not to be anyone's safety net anymore. Not because I stopped loving, but because I finally started loving myself enough to stop absorbing damage as proof of strength. There was a moment, a few weeks after everything had legally concluded, when I realized that justice and healing are not the same thing. The court had ruled, the restitution had been ordered, the criminal case had been processed. Rebecca had pleaded guilty, accepted probation, community service, mandatory counseling. The SUV had been auctioned. The funds were back in my account. On paper, the situation was resolved. But healing isn't paperwork. It doesn't arrive with a stamped seal and a signature at the bottom. It shows up slowly, in quiet moments when no one is watching. I remember the first time I walked back into my apartment after the sentencing without feeling tense. For months, every sound had felt amplified. Every vibration of my phone had carried potential confrontation. Now, the silence felt different, less like avoidance, more like space. That space allowed something unexpected to surface: grief. Not grief for the money, not grief for the legal process. Grief for the sister I thought I had. Grief for the version of my family I had defended in my mind for years. For so long, I had told myself that our dynamic was imperfect but functional, that Rebecca was chaotic but harmless, that my parents' favoritism was unintentional and manageable. I had rationalized everything because acknowledging the truth would have meant acknowledging that I was unprotected in ways I didn't want to admit. When the evidence unfolded in court, it didn't just expose Rebecca's fraud. It exposed the emotional infrastructure that allowed it to thrive. That realization lingered long after the courtroom emptied. One evening, my mother called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. "Can we talk?" she asked. We met the next day at her house. The living room looked exactly as it had when I was a teenager: the same couch, the same framed photos, the same decorative bowl on the coffee table. Familiar and unchanged. She sat across from me, hands folded tightly. "I keep replaying everything," she said. "The dinner, the phone calls, the times Rebecca needed help. I thought I was being compassionate." "You were," I said gently. "But I wasn't being fair," she added. That was new. For years, fairness had been an abstract concept in our family. Needs dictated response. Loudness commanded attention. Stability was assumed. I didn't realize how often we expected you to absorb things, she continued. We told ourselves you were strong enough. I was, I said. Until I wasn't. She nodded slowly. I should have seen it. That sentence landed differently than the earlier apologies in court. This wasn't about regret over legal consequences. It was about pattern recognition. I don't want to lose you, she said quietly. You're not losing me, I replied. But you are losing the version of me that fixes everything. She took that in carefully. Boundaries are strange at first. They feel like distance, like withdrawal. But what they really are is clarity. Rebecca, meanwhile, kept her distance. Probation required regular check-ins, financial counseling sessions, community service hours, logged meticulously. I heard updates indirectly through my parents, but I didn't seek them out. One afternoon, several months later, she requested to meet. I considered ignoring it. But part of me wanted to see her, not the version who laughed in a hospital waiting room, not the version who signed my name confidently on bank documents, but the version who had faced consequence. We met at a neutral cafe. She looked different, not dramatically, but subtly. Less polished, less certain. The confidence that once filled every silence seemed muted. I'm not here to ask you to drop anything, she began quickly. I know that's not possible. End quote. I didn't interrupt. I didn't think about it the way you did, she continued. I didn't think about the surgery as life or death. I thought about my situation as urgent. I always do. There it was, again, urgency as justification. But urgency doesn't erase harm, I said. She nodded. I know that now. There was a pause. For what it's worth, she added quietly, I was scared too. Not about you dying, about being stuck, about failing again. Her honesty wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tearful. It was matter of fact. I can't fix what I did, she said. No, I replied. You can't. But I didn't feel the sharpness I once had. I felt something steadier. I'm not cutting you out of my life forever, I continued. But trust isn't automatic anymore. It's rebuilt slowly, and it might never look the same. She nodded again. For the first time, there was no argument. Walking away from that meeting, I realized something important. Accountability doesn't guarantee transformation, but it creates the possibility for it. And that possibility had never existed before because consequences had never existed before. Back at work, my promotion settled into routine. I led meetings, reviewed budgets, mentored junior analysts. The hospital administration occasionally referenced my case as an example of institutional support for employees in crisis. I didn't relish the attention, but I didn't shrink from it either. For once, my story wasn't something I had to downplay. It was evidence of resilience. One evening, standing on my balcony as the sun dipped behind the trees, I reflected on how easily this could have unfolded differently. If I had dropped the charges, if I had smoothed things over again, if I had chosen comfort over clarity, the short-term peace would have been deceptive. Rebecca would have learned nothing. My parents would have continued their pattern, and I would have carried silent resentment into every family gathering. Instead, there was discomfort, distance, hard conversations. But there was also something new, respect. Not perfect, not immediate, but emerging. The real aftermath of what happened wasn't the courtroom ruling. It was the slow redefinition of roles. I was no longer the safety net. I was not the emergency fund. I was not the quiet absorber of impact. I was simply a person whose needs carried equal weight. And that realization, more than any legal victory, changed everything. Because justice corrected the external damage, but boundaries corrected the internal one. And for the first time in my life, those two things were aligned. If you had told me a year ago that the most difficult part of this story wouldn't be the surgery or even the courtroom, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have assumed the hardest moment would be lying under bright operating lights or hearing a judge read out criminal charges against my own sister. But the truth is, the most difficult part came later when everything was quiet again, and I had to decide who I was going to be moving forward. Life didn't explode after the sentencing. It didn't collapse either. It settled. Rebecca began her probation. She completed her community service hours at a local nonprofit that helped people with financial literacy, an irony that wasn't lost on anyone. She attended mandatory counseling sessions and made steady restitution payments, even after the car auction had covered most of what she owed. I didn't track her progress obsessively, but I heard about it from my parents. They spoke of her efforts cautiously, as if unsure how much I wanted to know. I realized something important during that period. I didn't need updates to feel secure. I didn't need proof that she was suffering or struggling. I didn't need her life to fall apart to feel vindicated. What I needed was distance and clarity, and I had both. 6 months after the trial, I barely recognized my own rhythm. My surgery had been successful. My scans were clear. My doctor told me there was every reason to believe the tumor would not return. I found myself breathing more deeply when I walked through the park near my apartment. I noticed things I hadn't before, the way sunlight filtered through leaves, the sound of children laughing near the playground, the steady pace of my own steps. I had moved into a new apartment shortly after my promotion at work. It wasn't extravagant, just a small place with a balcony overlooking trees instead of traffic. For years, I had lived in spaces that were functional and neutral. This time, I chose differently. I bought curtains in a color I liked instead of the cheapest option. I hung framed photographs instead of leaving walls blank. I allowed myself small indulgences that felt almost rebellious. The first plant I bought for the balcony was simple, a low-maintenance green one that could survive mild neglect. I watered it every Sunday morning with my coffee beside me. It became symbolic in ways I hadn't anticipated. Growth without drama, care without depletion. At work, my promotion to senior financial analyst had changed my responsibilities, but not my core approach. I was still organized, still precise, still measured. But there was a quiet shift in my posture. I no longer apologized before offering my opinion in meetings. I no longer softened my suggestions to avoid intimidating anyone. I spoke clearly and allowed my words to stand on their own. Resilience, the hospital director had called it, but it felt more like reclamation. My parents adjusted slowly to the new boundaries. My mother stopped asking whether I would ever fully forgive Rebecca, and instead began asking how I was feeling about my health. My father stopped telling me I would figure things out, and instead asked whether I needed anything. Those changes were subtle, but they mattered. There was one Sunday afternoon when my parents visited my new apartment for the first time. My mother looked around at the balcony and the plant and the framed photos, her expression soft. "You've built something beautiful," she said quietly. I didn't deflect the compliment. I didn't shrug it off. "I have," I replied. That exchange would have been impossible a year earlier. Rebecca and I maintained distance, but not hostility. The first time she sent a short message asking if I would consider meeting for coffee, I didn't feel anger. I felt caution. I agreed, on neutral ground, with no expectations. She arrived without theatrics. No dramatic apology, no defensive explanations, just quieter. "I've been thinking a lot about patterns," she said at one point, staring down at her cup, "about how I never thought anything would actually stick." That sentence stayed with me. Consequences had always slid off her before. Not because she was evil, but because the people around her, myself included, had shielded her from the full weight of them. "I can't undo what I did," she said. "I know that." "No," I answered gently, "you can't." But I also realized that healing doesn't require erasing the past. It requires integrating it. I didn't rush reconciliation. I didn't offer instant forgiveness. I didn't withdraw the boundaries I had set, but I also didn't close the door entirely. I allowed space for change without guaranteeing access. That was new for me. For most of my life, relationships were either preserved at all costs or severed completely. I had never practiced the middle ground measured proximity. There were moments, of course, when sadness surfaced unexpectedly. Family holidays felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. Conversations were more careful. The old rhythm was gone. But the old rhythm had nearly killed me. Sometimes, I would sit on my balcony in the early morning and replay everything in my mind: the hospital bed, the bank balance, Rebecca's laugh, the courtroom footage, my father's admission that they had failed me. It all felt distant now, like something that had happened to a previous version of myself. That version of me had believed strength meant absorbing everything quietly. This version understands that strength also means refusing to absorb what isn't yours. One evening, as I watered the plant and watched the sky turn orange behind the trees, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Patterson, the bank officer who had once apologized through tears for processing the fraudulent withdrawal. "I retired," she wrote. "Coffee next week?" I smiled. There was something deeply comforting about connecting with someone who had also been manipulated by the same story, the dying sister narrative. We had both been deceived by emotion packaged as urgency. "Yes," I replied. "I'd like that." Meeting her later that week felt unexpectedly healing. We talked about how easily compassion can be weaponized, how training yourself to assume good intentions can leave you vulnerable to exploitation. But we also talked about growth, about learning to balance empathy with verification. It struck me that what happened to me wasn't just a family story. It was a lesson in boundaries for anyone who has ever confused kindness with obligation. 6 months after the trial, I no longer woke up thinking about the court date. I woke up thinking about my schedule, my projects, my life. Rebecca was somewhere in the city, completing community service hours. My parents were learning how to relate to me without assuming I would cushion every crisis. And I was learning how to live without the constant hum of responsibility for everyone else's mistakes. The real victory wasn't watching Rebecca face consequences. It was realizing I didn't need to be anyone's safety net anymore. Not out of bitterness, not out of revenge, but out of self-respect. I used to believe being the strong one meant enduring silently. Now I understand it means knowing when to stop enduring and start protecting. And as I stood on that balcony, watering a small green plant that had begun to grow steadily under consistent care, I understood something with absolute clarity. I had survived more than a tumor. I had survived a pattern, and I had finally chosen a different one. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's that betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it grows quietly inside the very relationships we spend our lives protecting. This wasn't just a story about money or even about crime. It was about patterns, about what happens when one person is always expected to be strong and another is never expected to face consequences. It was about how silence can protect dysfunction for years, until one day it nearly costs you everything. Michelle didn't win because her sister was punished. She won because she stopped absorbing the damage. She chose boundaries over approval, accountability over comfort, and that's the part that matters most. Justice may happen in courtrooms, but real change happens when we decide we deserve better. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the strong one, the fixer, the quiet safety net, I hope you carry this with you. Choosing yourself is not selfish, it's survival. For more stories about truth, resilience, betrayal, and the courage to reclaim your life, subscribe to Revenge Tale Society. Stay with us. Your story matters more than you think.